Blood has to flow through the heart in one direction, and that's because the heart is the single pump for pumping blood all the way down to your big toe and back up to the heart and all the way up to your brain and back down as well. If there weren't structures in place that helped that blood move in one direction, then it would just kind of squish back and forth. Because during a typical heartbeat, the atria contract first, and then about a second later, the ventricles contract. And that ensures that the blood moves from the atria into the ventricles, and then from the ventricles out through the arteries, so either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. Now you can imagine when the ventricles contract, that could force the blood back up into the atrium, but that wouldn't be very efficient because then the blood would just be squished back and forth and it wouldn't ever get out to the body tissues. So that's where valves come into play. Between each atrium and ventricle, there is an atrioventricular valve, which is also just called an AV valve. So you can see on the right side of the heart, there's the right AV valve, which is also called the tricuspid valve. On the left side of the heart, between the left atrium and left ventricle, there's the left AV valve, which is also called either the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. And you can see that what we call the cusps of the valve are anchored to the ventricular wall by these connective tissue strings called chordae tendineae. And these chordae tendineae help to keep the flaps or the cusps of the valve from inverting when the ventricles contract. So what happens when the atrium contracts, blood is pushed through the AV valve into the ventricle. And then when the ventricle contracts, the blood actually pushes up against the valve, closing it off. And so the pressure causes the valve to close. And instead of going back up into the atrium, instead the blood is going to go out through one of the arteries leaving the heart. There are also valves found between the ventricles and the arteries that carry blood away from the ventricle. So we can see this a little more clearly on the right side of the heart. We've got our right ventricle here, and then we have the pulmonary semilunar valve here. And the semilunar valves, there's also one for the aorta over here, but it's kind of tucked behind the pulmonary trunk, so it's a little bit hard to see on the image. But the semilunar valves help to, once again, ensure that blood moves through the heart in one direction. So when the ventricle contracts, it causes the AV valve to close, and that pressure forces the semilunar valve to open. And so that blood gets pushed up and out of the heart through the artery. Now, when the ventricles relax, that blood is going to fall back towards the ventricle due to gravity, and that's when the semilunar valves close. So that ensures that when the ventricle contracts, the blood gets pushed up into the artery, and then when the ventricle relaxes, it keeps the blood from going all the way back into the ventricle. Instead, it gets stuck here, and then the next time the blood pushes open the semilunar valves, it pushes the blood from the previous contraction out further. So once again, as a recap, we've got the AV valves in between the atrium and the ventricle, and then the semilunar valves between a ventricle and an artery leaving the heart. And the purpose of the valves is to ensure that blood moves in one direction through the heart. So blood comes into the right atrium through either the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava. The atrium contracts and pushes blood into the ventricle. At that time, the AV valve is open. When the ventricle contracts, the AV valve closes and the semilunar valve opens. That helps to ensure that the blood goes in this direction rather than going back into the atrium. So after the blood moves up into the artery, when the ventricle relaxes, that blood starts to fall back down towards the ventricle, but the semilunar valves keep it from falling all the way back. And this helps to ensure that blood moves in this direction continually through the heart. And as I mentioned, this also happens on the left side of the heart. You've got your left atrium, your left AV valve into your left ventricle. And then there is an aortic semilunar valve here, which is at the base of the aorta. And so at the same time that blood is moving through the right side of the heart in this direction, on the left side of the heart, it's coming in through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, through the left AV valve, into the left ventricle, and then up and out through the aortic semilunar valve, and then out through the aorta. So once again, the function of the heart valves is just to make sure that the blood is moving in one direction through the cardiovascular system. So it keeps the circuit going, and it keeps the blood going through the circuit in one direction. Now, when you listen, when you go to the doctor and they use a stethoscope to listen to your heart, they can actually hear the closing of those valves. So the two heart sounds associated with a heartbeat are actually the sounds of the valves closing. So the first sound that's heard are the AV valves closing. So these are the valves between the atria and the ventricles. And the second sound are the semilunar valves closing. And these sounds help to give a clue as to whether the valves are working properly or not. Now, you may have heard the term heart murmur or just murmur. And a murmur is just an unusual heart sound caused by typically something going wrong with one or more of those valves. And so, for example, if one of those valves doesn't close properly, then the blood might go back into the previous location where it shouldn't be. So for example, if there's a murmur on the, maybe on the left side of the heart, it could be that when the ventricles contract, the left AV valve is not closing properly, and so some of the blood from the ventricle, instead of going out through the aorta, some of it squirts back up through the AV valve back into the atrium, and it gives it kind of a weird sound, and that's a clue to a doctor that there could be something wrong with the valve. Now, some murmurs are very, very mild and nothing to be too concerned about. Other murmurs can be more dangerous because, once again, if the blood's not moving in one direction through the heart, then the heart is not as efficient at getting materials to the cells of the body. Because remember, the function of the blood is to deliver nutrients and oxygen to our body cells and remove waste products from those body cells. So if the heart's not moving efficiently in one direction, then some serious negative effects could occur because the brain might not get enough oxygen and nutrients to function, or another organ might not get the proper oxygen it needs to function and survive.